share it. I am descended of I'm of Lithuanian descent, Lithuanian Jewish descent. I'm an ex-South African, and in 1993 we decided to leave South Africa, and my husband and I immigrated to Auckland in New Zealand, and then in 2005 we came to Melbourne, and so now living in Melbourne. I've always known that I'm part of Lithuanian descent, and tonight the way that I'm going to talk is a little bit different to how I've done all my other talks. I'm going to be mixing it with my grandfather's autobiography. So I'm going to be starting off with letting you know how how I came to know that my grandfather even had an autobiography. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And it is a little bit of an interesting story, and I know I've started 6 minutes late, and so I'm going to squish the story in a little bit quicker. In 2010, my second son was in year 7 at Mount Scotus. He was only there for 1 year, and those of you that would remember or would know, sometimes in year 7 you have to do a roots project. And I've always been very interested in family history and in Jewish history, and so I was like excited to get this roots project done. And I remembered when I was growing up that there was an autobiography that my great-grandfather had written, but no one really knew where it was. And so this autobiography, I grew up with all sorts of stories from the autobiography, all sorts of stories about my great-grandfather, but we didn't know actually if any of them were really true. And we knew there was this autobiography, no one knew where it was, but when the Roots Project came along, I decided, right, now is time. I was going to find the autobiography. And so with the help of my parents, this autobiography, which was just a typed pages, was eventually located, and it was with my late grandmother's stepsister. She was at that stage the only surviving sibling, much younger than my grandmother, and she had the autobiography. Anyway, my parents photocopied it, faxed it through to me in Melbourne, and the following year we included it in the Roots Project. So our Roots Project got the autobiography in it, well, photocopied version of it. And a year later, my grand's stepsister passed away. And that would have been the very end of the autobiography had that Roots Project not came along. So we wouldn't have ever found it. Basically, that would have been the end. So when I got this autobiography, actually, like I read through it, it is magnificently written. It's written in beautiful English. It reads like a storybook, and I couldn't believe that my great-grandfather had written this. I mean, his first language was Yiddish. He lived in an Afrikaans town in Lichtenberg. I couldn't believe it. I don't remember my grandfather very, very well. I was 8 when he passed away. Now you'll pretty much know how old I am. I was 8 when he passed away, and so I don't remember him very well. I just remember he lived in this magnificent house. Well, I thought it was magnificent. Anyway, I was very little in Houghton, and I remember the roses, and I remember this beautiful blue, sort of bluey grey plush carpet. And I remember my great-grandfather always like very well dressed, like he was like going somewhere special. But we were always there for like a Sunday afternoon tea, and it was very formal. So that's that was the only memory I had. I never asked him any questions about his youth. I didn't know anything. I was only a young girl, and at that stage, you don't ask, so you don't get the information, which is really sad, because now all I want to do is like quiz him on his question, on his story. Anyway, so going through the autobiography, I couldn't actually believe how, like, not just how beautifully it was written, but it was written as though it was written as though he was writing to a family that had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. So every Hebrew word or every Yiddish word or every concept in Judaism is very carefully explained. So if he like explains a cheder, for example, he'll give like an explanation for it. Or if he's explaining Aleph Beis, he'll actually give an explanation for it, or Talmud or Torah. Everything is explained. And it's as though he's writing for people who really like are completely ignorant of Judaism. And I think that, you know, when he passed away in 1979, the family had become very secular and probably actually didn't know very much at all, other than, you know, other than the odd little bit of, you know, Hebrew for a bar mitzvah, you know, or a wedding and a bris. But that was like about it. And that was what he, you know, that was what he was writing with the intention of, I think, to somehow keep this family tradition going up with knowledge in there. And it's amazing because this was prior to the Baal Tshuva movement in South Africa. And so like the younger generations then would have known a lot more than people maybe 2 generations back, or you know, even 1 generation back. But, you know, reading through the autobiography, like we recognize everything today, but there's been a sort of quite a big change in how people sort of address their Jewish identity now. So my great-grandfather was 89 when he passed away, and his autobiography is so detailed. He's only written it from his birth until 1915. Sorry, it ends in 1915. That's when that's where he got up to when he passed away. And the rest of the autobiography is like a tiny little passage like this. It literally of the rest of his life. So a daughter, don't know which one it is, or a son has added in, you know, 20 lines maybe of the rest of his life. So we would love to know what happened more. But I can tell you in great detail how he describes Lithuania in the first sort of 40 pages of the autobiography, which is up to 1915. So, okay, so what we need to do, he didn't actually tell us when he was born. He said he was born 8 days before Pesach in Nisan of 1891. All right, this is probably his era is a common time when other people came to live in South Africa. So the South Africans that are listening might be interested in this particular era. But if you're not South African and you are of Lithuanian descent or even interested in this era, I'm going to go back way before he was born and tell you how Jews got to Lithuania, what made them come to Lithuania, and what it was like at the time, and then why they left. And this is a 2-part series, so we'll do some today, and then the following, we're not nearly going to finish, but the rest of it will be next week, and hopefully we can take more than 100 people if people want to listen. Okay, so he says that he was born the 7th child to Zalman Aaron and Hannah Bela, and they lived in a little village called Pushalat, which is in the district of Ponevezh. We might have all heard of Ponevezh. It was a fairly sizable town in Lithuania, and they had a yeshiva attached to it later. So that's how we might remember this. It was right in the north of Lithuania. It's very close to the Latvian border. His surname was Dednovsky, from a village called Dednovsky, a village called of Detnau, and they had changed the surname to Dat, which is a common thing. And then he explains how Tsar Alexander I made Jews actually have surnames, because they didn't have surnames before this. They were so-and-so son of so-and-so, or so-and-so daughter of so-and-so. But after Alexander I came in Russia, and at that stage, Lithuania was part of the Russian Empire, Jews suddenly had to have a surname. And so very often they chose a town. You weren't allowed to choose a big city. That was not allowed if you were Jewish. But very often people chose a town. And if they didn't choose a town, they chose a profession, or as my great-grandfather wrote to it, there were others who had a particular fondness for that metal, and so they would introduce gold into their surnames. So it didn't necessarily mean that they were working with gold, but they liked gold, and so they put it into their surname. And so we see, he talks about Pushalat, and I'm going to show you now. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and I want to show you. Okay, we can have a look. If you look over here, this is just a typical shtetl on top here, and this at the bottom is an image from Pushalat. All right, this is my great-grandfather. I don't know if you can see all the pictures here. His name is Benjamin Dat, born in 1881, and he passed away in 1979. This is him over here. I don't know if you can see me pointing, not sure. Him again, and this would have been my great-grandmother, Polly, or Pera Dat. And right down at the bottom here is my great-grandfather with his 6 kids. And next to him is my grandmother, Sylvia. All right, so I just want to show you Lithuania. So if we look at Lithuania today, it's this tiny little yellow area. Can you all see that on the map? Yeah, it's small, right? Small little country sitting in the Baltic states. It's the southernmost Baltic state. To the southwest is Poland, the southeast is Belarus, to the north is Latvia, and to the west is the Baltic Sea. And so you can sort of see Ukraine is down there as well. And we'll see how Lithuania changes its size so much over the years. Okay, so how and why did Jews come to Lithuania? Because we don't originate from Lithuania. Most of the Jews in Lithuania are Ashkenazim. So those of you that don't know, Ashkenaz was the ancient lands of France and Germany, especially around the Rhineland. But France and Germany essentially is where Ashkenazi Jews come from. And Jews lived there for a long time, but certainly in big communities from the 800s onwards. And when the First Crusade happened in 1096, many of the communities were decimated around the Rhineland, and the Jewish communities were seriously affected by the First Crusade. And that was also the beginning of medieval anti-Semitism. Things got progressively worse. I don't know, I'm going to try and move this picture. I don't know if you guys can see. Can you see? There's like a picture of a man carrying a Jewish hat. So Jews started to be forced to wear specific clothing. You can see here at the bottom, there's a picture of Peter the Hermit there, initiating a huge amount of crowds to go and attack Jewish people, but also attack anyone who was an infidel. So the Crusades, the Crusades were trying to get to the Holy Land, and in the process they realized that there were these Jews in the way, and well, they were the infidel too, so they may as well get to them first. And many communities were destroyed. So Jews started to look to move elsewhere, and they started to move around, certainly move east in Germany, away from the Rhineland. The Rhinelands were really very close to the French-German border. And we can see, if you look at that map there, you'll see movements. You see that big one on top there, it says 1096 to 1192. So that's during that whole Crusade period. You see people moving over east. And as I said before, medieval anti-Semitism got particularly nasty. There were blood libels during the time of plague, so that was 1348. That was the bubonic plague. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. They were accused of causing plague, and there were many like pogroms, of what we now call a pogrom, against the Jewish communities in the Ashkenazi Jewish communities in Germany and in France. And so Jews started to move eastward. So that was after 1348, after plague. And then there were many expulsions. Jews were expelled from France, actually 3 times, from 1306. Jews were expelled from England in 1290. Jews were expelled from Bohemia and Moravia. And of course, from different provinces or different principalities of Germany. Germany wasn't one big country. It was lots of many different principalities. And so Jews needed to go somewhere. Spain wasn't so good at that time either. And of course, there was expulsion in 1492 from Spain, and then 1497 from Portugal. So where did you go? Okay, so there was this big country, vast country in the east. There was Poland, and there was what's called the Kingdom of Poland, and there was Lithuania, which was the Duchy of Lithuania. Lithuania was not a kingdom. And so Jews started to move there. Now, why did they want Jews? Because this was kind of an uncommon thing in the Middle Ages. Most people didn't want Jews. The reason that they wanted was the Mongol invasions that happened at the end of the 13th century, end of the 1200s. Mongol invasions had happened in Poland and in Lithuania and had decimated many, many towns there, and they were in dire need of people to build up these towns. The economy was shattered, and it was a rural economy anyway, but they really needed towns to be rebuilt. And so they invited Germans and German Jews to come and settle in Poland and in Lithuania during this time. And once the Jews came, there had to be suddenly statutes that would allow Jews to have rights in the place and to decide, you know, what to do with the Jews. So we get in a whole bunch of statutes. Firstly, in Poland, we get the statute of Kalisz, and that is in 1264 with Duke Boleslav V. And he basically makes a whole lot of laws based on this thing called Magdeburg Recht, which came from Germany, on how Jews were allowed, the rights that Jews had to live in a place. And actually, Jews had more rights under this statute of Kalisz than they had in any other place in the Middle Ages. And then Casimir the Great came along in Poland, and he ratified the statute. And then in 1388, the Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania, he made a statute that was very, very similar to the statute of Kalisz. And what he did was, at that time, there were approximately 6,000 Jews living in Lithuania. And these 6,000 Jews were given protection of person and protection of movement as well. They could live wherever they wanted. They could do any profession, really, that they wanted. There was like a quasi-feudal system in Lithuania at the time. And Jews were given a position really above peasants. It was still an agricultural community. And so there was still definitely, you know, there was the Duke and then there was nobility. The Jews were absolutely under the nobility, but the Jews were sort of like the go-between between the peasants and the nobility. So they actually, whilst it wasn't a good place in the feudal system, they actually had a place in the feudal system, which made a big difference compared to Western Europe, where Jews were below the feudal system. So, you know, the same places like grasshoppers, not humans. So the people in Lithuania actually were not overly anti-Semitic. Actually, Christianity came last to Lithuania. It was the last country in Europe to take on Christianity, only in the 1300s, which is very late compared to the rest of Europe. And they weren't sure, you know, were they going to be Catholic, were they going to be Orthodox? And this sort of infighting took a little while until they eventually settled on Catholicism, and because it joined Poland, and so it had to have the same religion as Poland. But the people were not intrinsically anti-Semitic, and there was they hadn't been exposed to all that sort of medieval anti-Semitism that they had been in Western Europe. So once they were allowed to live in Lithuania, I'm going to show you the next picture here. Something happened in Lithuania and Poland in the year 1569. You can see it a little bit better here. Now, do you remember that tiny little yellow spot on the map that was Lithuania? Okay, now you see how big this area is? This was the biggest country in Europe. This was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it was absolutely huge. It took up more land than any other country in Europe. It comprised Poland and Belarus and Ukraine and Lithuania and Latvia and part of Estonia as well. And it came about because of a union between partners, a husband and wife in Lithuania and in Poland. And so we have for a very long time a very, very big piece of land that is occupied by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's mostly rural, but there's towns of spotted everywhere in there. And they have an interesting system with Polish nobility and also Lithuanian nobility owning land, and Jews coming to sort of lease the land out to the peasants. In general, I'm just going to stop sharing here so I can talk to you a little bit. Okay. So in general, the Jews had a really good life there for a very long time. They lived in little shtetls, which were little towns. They had freedom of movement, so they could live anywhere in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There wasn't one specific area of land, like we've all become accustomed to the Pale of Settlement, but I'll explain to you that comes very much later. It was fairly protected in the shtetl. There weren't necessarily pogroms or anything like that. Jews often leased land, as I said, from the Polish nobility, but they'd also lease things like mills and ponds, and they'd lease these out to the peasants, collect money and make a little bit of a profit, and then that was their money. And so they traded in alcohol. Actually, alcohol was a big trade amongst the Jewish population, and so they didn't actually drink it, but they did definitely trade it. They also had a measure of independence. There was in Poland something called the Council of Four Lands, the autobiography, where Jewish it sort of managed Jewish communal life itself. So it was an independent Jewish body that managed Jewish life and also collected taxes from Jews. And Lithuania had one of those as well. They had the Va'ad Medinat Lita, and that was really comprised of the four main communities of the time, which was Grodno, Slatsk, Brest, and Pinsk. And those were that really governed what happened with Jewish life in Lithuania. If there were any disputes or if the authorities had any questions, then it went through the council. And that really protected Jews because there was a sort of like a governing body protecting them, but it also made sure that they didn't charge too much for leasing out land or their mills or their ponds, and they didn't charge too much for alcohol, and it also made sure that they did pay a lot of money towards tax for the Polish-Lithuanian government. And it was a very rich cultural life because people spoke Yiddish. Now, Lithuanian Yiddish is a little bit different from Polish Yiddish. So there are like two kinds of Yiddish essentially. There's Western Yiddish and there's Eastern Yiddish. And Western Yiddish is like from the original lands of Ashkenaz, German, France. And Eastern Yiddish has also got some Slavic in it, and it's really Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, that whole Latvia, that whole area. Now, even within Eastern Yiddish, there's different kinds of Yiddish. There's Northeastern Yiddish, there's Central Yiddish, and there's Southeastern Yiddish. So people that spoke Northeastern Yiddish, which is the dialect of the northeastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, those people were called Litvaks. Okay, so you didn't have to be living in Lithuania proper. It didn't need to be like what we now know as Lithuania. You could be living in Belarus, but there was still the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth, and you would still be speaking your northeastern version of Yiddish. So you were a Litvak. I'll never forget when I met somebody and they told me where they were from, and they said, "Oh, they're Litvak and they speak Litvish." And then they told me where they were from, and I'm going like, "No, that's not Lithuanian." They said, "Oh, yes, they're from Lithuania," but they were from Lithuania when it was like one big giant country. And Litvaks are people that speak Litvish, which is the northeastern dialect of Yiddish. Okay, people also lived in People lived in little towns called shtetls, which we spoke about before. They went to cheder for school, and then afterwards they would maybe learn with a private tutor if they were a very good teacher. This was before the yeshiva system came along. Now, I'll just go very briefly into what happened to this big gigantic country called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because it was such a powerful country. How did it break up? And the truth of it is that no empires last forever, and it did last for it lasted for 300 years, more 350 years, which is, if you think about it now, quite a long time actually for an empire to last. And it started to break down with time. It was too big. It was too big and too difficult to control. And the whole structure of leasing out land to peasants and collecting taxes was actually a very difficult structure, and it promoted a lot of discontent within a certain peasant group, definitely the peasants living in the Ukraine, the very southern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who felt that they should be independent, who felt that they were, their overlords were Catholic, forcing them to be Catholic. They were Russian Orthodox. There was a lot of problems. And unfortunately for the Jews, these Cossack uprisings that started around 1648 under Bogdan Khmelnytsky, is a very difficult name to pronounce, but Khmelnytsky, these Cossack uprisings, unfortunately, really not just ruined the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and broke down the structure, but completely decimated many, many Jewish communities. So in the 2 years, 1648 to 1649, years we call Tach B'Tat, these Cossacks came right through southern Poland, and they came actually all the way up to Lithuania. 50,000 Jews were killed in the 2 years, and then up till 1653, there were another 50,000 Jews that were either killed by marauding Cossacks or by being displaced and having nowhere to live and starving along the way. So 100,000 Jews, that is a giant amount in a very short time, were killed in the Cossack uprisings of 1648, actually all the way to 1653. But that massive displacement of Jews really shook the Jewish community, and it was actually never really the same in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But not just was it not the same, it wasn't the same for people living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because that whole structure of those latifundia, those huge big tracts of land owned by nobility, leased down through Jews to the peasants, that whole structure was broken. And when structure is broken, we get chaos. And actually from that period all the way until the late 1700s, there was really war in the Lithuanian Commonwealth. There was civil war, and then other countries, when they see that there's civil war and they see it's weak, then they invade. So there were many invasions. There were invasions from Sweden, there were invasions from the Tatars, there was all sorts of invasions into Lithuania. Russia wanted a piece, Austria wanted a piece, Germany wanted a piece, everybody wanted a piece of this big giant country. And so by the end of the 1700s, by 1792, there were actually 3 partitions of Poland, 1792 all the way to 1795. Poland and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Poland essentially, is completely wiped off the map. So that big giant country that you saw there is non-existent after, absolutely non-existent after 1795. It's been chopped up by these enlightened despots. From Russia, we've got Catherine the Great, we've got from Austria, and we've got from Prussia. They each take a piece. And the country that takes the most is Catherine the Great, okay? Catherine II, Catherine the Great, not so great for Jews, actually very, very bad for Jews, because she suddenly inherits 1.5 million Jews into her big chunk of land, all in the West, and she decides, well, she doesn't want 1.5 million Jews living in her country, and so she seals them off in a narrow strip of land called the Pale of Settlement. And you've all heard of that. So that happens after Lithuania is partitioned to Russia, as Lithuania becomes part of Russia. Parts of Poland become Russia as well. Other parts of Poland become parts of Austria, and other parts of Poland become parts of Prussia. But Lithuania becomes part of Russia, and that has a huge influence on what happens next, because they're left in this little strip of land called the Pale of Settlement with communities dotted all over, but they can't actually leave the Pale. If you leave the Pale, you need a passport, and that passport's going to expire, and you need a very good reason to be living there. There's police coming after you all the time, and this is actually precisely what happened to my great-grandfather. So, and I'll get to that bit later. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about returning now to the autobiography. I'm just going to share the screen if I can. And get some pictures that I didn't do, like okay. We'll get to, right. I don't know if you can see this. I'm going to try and move this. Okay, so this, going back to the autobiography, this is my great-grandfather's town. This is a little town called Pushelat. Okay, so I looked for Pushelat on the map. I couldn't find one map with Pushelat. So I went into my Google Maps and I typed, I want to go to Pushelat, and I spelled it in Lithuanian, which is like Pushelata. And I found it. And he wrote that they live right near Panovich. So I can see over here, I don't know if you can see me pointing, I'm not sure, but Panovich is like right in the middle there. We can see Kaunas. So Kaunas is the Lithuanian name now, but Jews called this place Kovna. So if you know anyone that was from Kovna, they were from Kaunas. Okay, the biggest city. Here, over here, if you know anyone from Vilna, that's Vilnius. All right. And over here, Panovich is over there, and just above it in black, which is not because it's a big place. It's a teeny, weeny little place. I think it has now about 1,000 people. When he lived there, it had 600, so it like never really grew. Is that tiny little place called Pushelat. There's still some buildings remaining in Pushelat. I could find on the internet. There's this one over here. I'm not sure what that was. If that was I couldn't find what it was, but if someone's taken a picture of it and stuck it on the internet. But that is from the shtetl of Pushelat. And we can see on this big map here that, see this like dark green line around here? So the dark green line is what is Lithuania now. But at the time that my great-grandfather was living there, so this is the period 1867 to 1914, I had to try and find a map that was from that period. But anyway, this was what Lithuania looked like. So it was even then, and so this is after, after the partition, and so Lithuania is already its own country, it's already part of Russia, but it was much bigger. So parts here that are now Belarus, that was still very much part of Lithuania all the way up until the First World War. Okay, now what happened with my great grandfather is he lived in Pushelat, but at some stage he went to go and work in Kurland. So Kurland is just above here. You can see just above Panovich, and Kurland is actually Latvia. Now Kurland was beyond the Pale. You weren't allowed to work in Kurland if you were born in Lithuania. You were only allowed to be Jewish living in Kurland if you were born in Kurland, or if your family had been in Kurland for, before the partition. So my great-grandfather's born 100 years after the partition. So for sure, he could not live in Kurland. He had a sister living in Kurland, and so he went to go and work there. But he said the police were after him all the time. He had to keep on showing a passport, and he had like the wrong passport. So at some stage, he actually got kicked out of Kurland. But those people that were lucky enough to be born in Latvia were allowed to live there. It was beyond the Pale, and so the economic conditions of Jews living in that area was infinitely better than it was in the Pale of Settlement. I'm just going to go back down here. Oops, I'm going to move everyone so that I can actually share my screen. Whoops, that's touch. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. All right. Okay, so just to get back to the shtetl and back to the autobiography, my great-grandfather spoke at length about being in Cheder. So they went when they were very, very young, they went to Cheder, and they went by themselves. The family were very, very poor. His father was the spiritual leader of the town, but they still were very poor. And so he explained, and he writes beautifully. So I'll actually read a little bit of from there. He says when he was 5, he had a teacher called Bensi the Melamed, Bensi the teacher, and we read about. I'm going to use his writing here. He said he fell asleep during class. His long flowing beard extending over his folded arms onto the table upon which he rested, while trying to stick his beard to the table with molten wax from the lit candle. He awoke and inadvertently set his treasured beard alight. This was my great-grandfather. Tried to stick Bensi the Melamed's beard to the table. Yes, he spoke about the punishment that he received after that as well. But you can just imagine this like little shtetl with this like little wooden house, like the little house that we saw there with the candle. Obviously, there's no electricity, and a few little boys sitting in there. I mean, he was like 5, with Bensi the Melamed, with this long white beard, and his fallen asleep while he's trying to teach the poem. So it sort of conjures up a lot of images of what we might have of life in the shtetl. And he then moved. He moved from one teacher, and then he said by the time he was 10, he had finished learning the whole Torah. He was obviously a good student, and then he had a private tutor who then taught him, and he got into Slobodka. So Slobodka was at that time a very famous yeshiva in a suburb of Slobodka, which is right next to Kovna. So not too far from where he lived. His family had moved quite far away at that time to another town, and him and his brother went off to Slobodka. His brother was older than him, and he explains and describes Slobodka in very great detail. Now, those of you that don't know, Slobodka was called the mother of yeshivas. And that was because the level was very, very, very high at Slobodka. But interestingly enough, it was a yeshiva that had actually split into 2. It was a Musa yeshiva. Okay, the Musa movement was a movement that started in the late 1800s with Rabbi Yisrael Salanta. He started the Musa movement, which really focused on ethical behavior, self-discipline, self-criticism, trying to better yourself as much as possible. And so this yeshiva was essentially a Musa yeshiva. So it would have been very difficult for a young boy, I guess, going to a yeshiva like Slobodka, which was really not just like intense studying, but it was also heavily intense on your person itself, on bettering yourself all the time. I know I've had teenagers myself, and I can just imagine a teenager at a Musa yeshiva. Slobodka had actually split at that time. There were 2. There was the Musa heavy part of the yeshiva and the Musa light part of the yeshiva. He was actually in the Musa light part of the yeshiva, which was called Beis Knesset Yitzchak, and that was after Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, who had been the rabbi of Kovna. I'll just explain to you a little bit about how the yeshiva system actually happened in Lithuania and what started it. I'm going to try and share my screen here for a second. I'm going to go off. I need to move this. Hang on. Can I move this? I want to move this. I'm trying to move this. Okay. That's plan of settlement. I'm having trouble moving. There's the shtetl. I'm trying. Whoops. There we go. Okay. That's much better. Okay. That's what I want. We've got here the Vilna Gaon and the yeshiva movement. So I just want to explain to you a little bit about how the yeshiva movement started. Basically, in Lithuania, Judaism had gone a little bit weak. So there was a little bit of apathy. There was not so much learning. People were very poor. And along came a man who was spectacular. He was the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was a genius of note. His name was Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman. We know him as the Vilna Gaon, as the Gra. He was born in a small town in Lithuania, and he displayed extraordinary talent as a child, and then as an adult became the undisputed leader of Jews in Lithuania. At the time, as I said before, people were very ignorant, and he wanted to change this. He wanted people to study more, and he himself was actually a very quiet person. He never took on a rabbinical role, but he was the undisputed spiritual leader. And so just by having him around, he sort of inspired an entire movement to start. One of his disciples was a man called Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin started the very first yeshiva in Volozhin, the Volozhin yeshiva. And all the other yeshivas that then sprung up based on this yeshiva in Volozhin. Slobodka was one, Mir, Panovich, Telsha, we know these names. Basically, they made Torah study very important. Young boys, smart young boys, would be able to go to yeshiva. The whole concept of studying in the yeshiva became a very desirable one. It was very intense. It gave rise to a whole new yeshiva bocha, a boy who was very learned, who could really go up in the world. Someone who might have been very poor with very little proposition could suddenly really, go up in the world because he was a yeshiva bocha. And so this movement really took hold in Lithuania. And so we know that Lithuania is very, very famous for its yeshivas. At the same time, we know the Lithuanians as the Misnagdim. In fact, we sometimes call ourselves Misnagdim. So who were the Misnagdim? The Misnagdim were the opponents. It's not so nice to call yourself the opponents, but essentially the opponents were people involved who were opposing Chabad, were opposing the Hasidism movement. Hasidism had started with the Baal Shem Tov in the late, really in the late 1600s, early 1700s, it really developed, and by the late 1700s was fully developed. Had moved all throughout, started in southern Poland, Ukraine, had moved all the way up into Lithuania, and actually the movement now that we know of as Chabad, which was started by Rabbi Shneor Zalman of Liadi, that movement of Chabad actually started in Lithuania. And so the Misnagdim were opposing the opposition, which was really Chabad. They were opposing Hasidism. And the two actually fought each other tooth and nail. There were huge disputes that happened over the next 100 years, like really bad disputes where they would go and complain to the Russian government about each other. Shocking. The only time they actually realized they had more in common than not was when the Haskalah, which was the Enlightenment movement, which was pro-secularism. Once that started in Lithuania and in Poland, suddenly, but especially in Lithuania, suddenly the Misnagdim and the Hasidic people realized actually they had much, much more in common than those in the Haskalah, and they sort of banded together and stopped their war against each other. So the Haskalah really began to take hold in Lithuania in the late 1700s, early 1800s, mid 1800s. Had really taken hold, and it actually found its way. This is the secular movement in Lithuania. It's sort of more a cultural revolution. People were involved in Yiddish, Jewish culture, and also as well socialism, communism. That it became quite involved in that in Eastern Europe, not so much in Western Europe. But these ideas of the Haskalah actually infiltrated the yeshivas, and there were many books floating around yeshivas to try and get like sort of vulnerable yeshiva boys to pick up on the Haskalah if they were in any way disenfranchised at the yeshiva. I'm stopping to share for a moment because I will tell you that my great-grandfather was one of those people. So whilst he described in great detail his love for Slobodka and how there were 400 students studying at the same time, and he says his spiritual needs were very, very well fulfilled, but his physical needs were not. It sounds like he was starving most of the time. When you read it, it literally reads as though he's looking for food all the time. That's not really what we think of when we think of yeshiva. He explains how he gets really excited when a guy comes around with like buckets over his shoulders with pieces of bread in it, and how Motzei Shabbos they would all cross over into Kovna, which was the main town, and to try and get food from the Jewish community there because they were really hungry. And he said the Jewish community would provide hearings for these young boys in big halls. But if they were super lucky, they would be lucky enough to be invited to a family for a meal. But it almost never happened. It sounded like he wrote that they waited outside shuls, Motzei Shabbos, to see if people, when they came out, they'd invite these boys over, but it looked like that was a very rare occasion. So he explains that him and his brother were extremely close, and his brother leaves the yeshiva. We have no explanation in the autobiography why he leaves the yeshiva, but his brother leaves the yeshiva, and he sort of leaves this young teenager very forlorn and alone and by himself, and without, like, it sounds like his mentor was gone, and hungry, and he is found, according to the autobiography, he is found reading a book by, and he describes it very carefully, but I have honestly looked everywhere for this book and I can't find it on Google, but so, you know, he must have the title slightly wrong. One who erred in his ways. It was a Haskalah book by a man called Smolensky. I can't find it, but a Haskalah book. He's found reading this book and he gets expelled from yeshiva. I can imagine how horrified his parents would have been, because he was obviously, a good enough student to get into Slobodka. One would be very proud that your child was in Slobodka, but then, he was expelled from Slobodka for reading a book on one who erred in his ways, on the Haskalah. So he was obviously, one of those boys that was affected by the Haskalah coming into the yeshiva, and we do know that Slobodka was actually heavily infiltrated by the Haskalah. Okay, so do you remember I told you he then went to go and work as a teacher, and then he went to go and work in Kurland, and the work he was doing in Kurland was a laborer. So he was working, lifting heavy sacks basically for 3 years. He was working from 7 in the morning until 10 at night. It looked like that was when shops closed, and it doesn't sound like he had much of a life, but he was quite happy living there. And then something happened. He had to leave Kurland, and he got a call up to the army, and this was a bad thing. So why did he and many others leave Lithuania at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, really before the First World War? Of course, we have Jews leaving Lithuania all the way through to the Second World War, and luckily, because in the Second World War, we'll talk all about the wars and the interwar period next week. But it was terrible for Jewish people in Lithuania during the war, shocking. And I won't give you any more clues. But it was a very good thing that he left, and then other Jews left. Now, why did they leave? So his reason was very clear. He was called up to the Russian army, and he had no intentions of going to the Russian army. Now, the Russian army used to be, it was a death sentence if you were called up to the Russian army in previous times. I don't know if you've heard of the Kentonist laws, but Kentonist laws were actually not around when my great-grandfather was around, but they had been instituted by that very same Alexander I that made surnames compulsory. Not finished. He insisted that Jews from the age of 12 were called up to the army, where they would serve until they were 18, and from the age of 18 they would then serve for 25 years. Jews were often baptized in those early years, and they lost all contact of being Jewish, and very often would die in the army. So those were the Cantonist laws. The Cantonist laws had actually been stopped for some time before my great-grandfather was called up. But those ideas of being called up to the Russian army was still very terrifying for people. And we know that had he been called up to the army, he would have, because you served for 4 or 5 years at least, he would have been in the First World War, and that would have been completely disastrous. So he left, and so did many other Jewish men leave from Lithuania because they were called up. Why else did people leave? Well, Jews were living at the time in the Pale of settlement, and the Pale was terrible, as we spoke about before, economically. It was very, very difficult economically to live there, and so they looked for greener pastures. And of course, Jews had gone already from, other communities, had gone to America, they'd gone to England, they'd gone to South America, they'd gone to South Africa, they'd gone to Australia, they had gone to Eretz Israel. And there was, the Lithuanian community was quite small, like everyone sort of knew each other. And so word of mouth would come back of great wealth that was coming from South Africa. It, of course, was post gold rush in Johannesburg and diamonds in Kimberley. And they heard that you could make a lot of money in South Africa. And so if you went to South Africa, you could send your money back home, and you could keep your family back in the home, back in Lithuania surviving, and you yourself could live a much better life. So that was a reason that many, many people left. Another reason was there were these huge pogroms at the turn of the century in Odessa and then in Kishinev. Kishinev had 2 major pogroms, 1903 and 1905, where many Jews, scores of Jews were killed, and there were massacres on atrocities on a horrible level. And so many Jews got scared, and they realized that Russia was not going to look after its Jews. They became very paranoid about living in any area that was owned by Russia, Tsarist Russia, and were scared, and so left. And so you've got these 3 big pools: the army, the economics, poverty, and promise of wealth in other countries, as well as pogroms and safety. And those were enough reasons to make millions of Jews leave Eastern Europe. Around 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe from the late 1800s until the beginning of the First World War. And that was when he left. So I'm going to just show you a little picture. I'll share the screen, and I know I must finish very, very soon. Hang on, I will just try over here and look at Jewish immigration here, and just look at where people went. So we can see that big wave over there to America, a wave to Canada, England, South America, there's South Africa, you can see up there, Israel, and then there's a few that go to Australia as well there. So you've got a number of people leaving. What we're going to do next week, stop sharing. What we'll do next week is we'll look at where the Jews went from Lithuania in more detail. We'll look at what happened in Lithuania just before First World War, during the First World War, and then that intermediate period between the wars, and then what happened to Jews after, what happened to Jews in the Second World War in Lithuania, and then after. So we'll look at the rest of Jewish history of Lithuania. We've done tonight, from, I don't know, 1200, from 1200 all the way through to 1900. And this is where we leave the autobiography, and where we leave Lithuania for this week.
Thank you very much, Bear. That was really, really interesting. And as people were listening, some people messaged me, is it going to be recorded? So I just want to reassure everybody it has been recorded. You will be able to watch it either on Facebook whenever you want, or I'm going to send a YouTube link. So there'll be many ways to catch up on this. Also, just to let everyone know, obviously next Sunday night at 8 p.m. will be part 2, as Bev just mentioned, which we'll be going through. And for the rest of this week, there are some other fascinating talks tomorrow night, and we have increased our Zoom capacity for tomorrow and through the rest of the week. And for next week, tomorrow night, we are having Jewish life in Nigeria. Come and listen to Rabbi and Rebbetzin Yisrael and Chaya Uzan. It should be really fascinating. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, they'll talk about their work in Nigeria. And then on Tuesday night, we have another fascinating talk with Cindy Cree. She's talking about bringing change across the world, lessons that she's learned from criminals. She worked as a social worker in jails in South Africa. Wednesday night, we have Lauren Streifer, whose goal is making 1 million children feel safe and loved through reading. She's just launched her first book. And then on Thursday night, just for something a little bit lighter, not calories lighter, but lighter in terms of talks, Rebitz and Sarah will be teaching everyone how to bake parava pumpkin pie, one of her favorite dishes. So please join us. And again, a big thank you to Bev. I'm going to end the live stream on Facebook, but if anyone has any questions, you're most welcome to. Bev will stay on for a few more minutes, she said, if there are any other questions. But wonderful to have you all with us. And as I said, please join us next week. And of course, if any of the other talks are of interest, we'd love to see you there as well. So have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Bezrat Hashem.